All right, good day and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to have Dr. Dan Patterson with us today. Dr. Dan have extensive experience in the area of risk management, project planning, capital project, and he's been involved from my perspective also in what we call the startup world, at least in 3 startups with exit, which means this is definitely from the technology, and all of those are technological solution, software solution in the project management domain. He's also PhD in project management. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I will give Dan the opportunity to talk. And we're going to be doing this more of an interview question style. And I have a few questions to ask. And of course, if some of you would want to jump in as well with some question, please feel free. Dan, welcome. And it's a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mounir. I'm very excited to get into some lively discussion together today. And yeah, thank you very much for considering me as part of your webinar series.
Thanks. To start very quickly, in terms of the background of the topic, CAPEX, forecasting, analytics, project life cycles, who are you?
Sure. Great question. So in many ways, I describe myself, Mounir, as a one-trick pony. So I've given my entire professional career, which is about 2.5 decades now, but I've given it to the science of planning and forecasting. And, you know, I was a civil engineer by education, and as part of that, during my summer vacations at university, I got the opportunity to work on construction sites as a student engineer. And what I observed was, at best, organized chaos during the construction phase. And it was interesting for me because, you know, the blame was always put on poor execution. You know, there's the age-old comment around, you plan the work and then you work the plan, and it was the execution that caused the cost and schedule overruns. And I had a bit of a realization very early on in my career, whereby I said, look, at the end of the day, execution is what it is. We track and monitor execution, and we track performance by comparing execution back to something, and that something is a plan. Well, what if our plan was unrealistic and largely unachievable? Then really the root cause of failure isn't execution, it's the fact that our plan wasn't representative enough of how we were going to execute the project when it got to the execution phase. So ever since then, I focused my efforts on improving the science of scheduling. And I'm probably going to get into dangerous waters here, because I actually don't really believe in the concept of inventing. You know, inventing is to create something. And as humans, we've been scheduling and forecasting for thousands and thousands of years. Okay. What I do believe in, though, is innovation, which is making something better. And so in the last 20+ years, what we've brought to the project management community is incrementally better ways of predicting the future. In other words, planning. And that's an incredibly long-winded way of explaining how I got into, I guess, the risk management industry, which is what we focus on today.
Great. Actually, I didn't know that background, because it sounds similar to mine, because I started on construction site, and that's what attracted me to shift from civil engineering to project management. That was a bit longer than you, which is all this gray hair.
I'm not sure it was that much longer, but yes.
Before we get into you know, talking about risk and life cycle, I think it might be useful to talk a little bit about, okay, you mentioned that is many of, you know, we blame execution sometimes on failure, but usually failure is caused before. What should have happened before we get to execution in terms of project life cycle?
That's a great question. So again, for me, it all boils back down to realism of planning. You know, when a project embarks, if we want to sort of look at the project in stages, you typically have the very early sort of concept select stage where you're trying to solve a problem or build an asset, you're just not sure how to do it yet, how should the asset perform, etc. And then you get into more, early design, detailed design through to execution. But in all of those phases, there is planning involved. And again, I think as humans, it's a blessing and a curse. We are naturally optimistic. We want to finish as quickly as possible. And I think when we plan, because of that optimism bias, it's not natural for us to take into account the things that might go wrong. So in the world of construction, things that might go wrong, that gets modeled as, risk events in a risk register, for example.
Yeah.
And I think when we plan, using globally accepted tools like Primavera, Microsoft Project, gosh, some people I know even use, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Excel. It doesn't really matter the planning platform. My point is, I think as an industry, we need to do a better job of identifying the things that could slow us down or cost us more money. And it's okay to incorporate those into the plan, because if we know the potential pitfalls and downfalls, especially very early on in the project lifecycle, we have a much higher chance of planning how to reduce that risk, whether it's through mitigation, insurance, avoidance. And Mounir, I think what's really interesting for me is in the early days of risk assessments, maybe 15 years ago, when it was starting to become accepted, within the project management community as a valuable means of helping plan, it was considered something you would do just before execution. And thankfully, I think we've come full circle where both owners and contractors realize now, if you break your project down into stages, and whether you call that gates, phases, stages, it doesn't matter. But if you embrace that risk identification and assessment as early on as possible, that's a massive, massive benefit. And not to harp on about risk, I wish we, as an industry, we had named risk management confidence management, because for me, we do risk assessments, we do all this clever modeling, Monte Carlo, blah, 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 that's great. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're increasing our confidence in when we're going to complete the CAPEX project and by how much money it's going to cost us. So the biggest take home or lesson learned for me in the last 20 years is the earlier in the project life cycle we can hook those risk elements, those risk events, the uncertainties into our forecast, the better our forecast becomes as it moves through its life cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting because often I actually have an interesting perspective on the word confidence, because we often debate whether we should call risk or uncertainty. Now you brought in another, cat in the hat in a way. So now we have one more word to consider. I usually look at the early stages of the project, for example, feasibility stage, as the first really major risk exercise. However, unfortunately, often enough when we start to talk about some of the certification training and we talk about risk management and we do that as a part of planning, we forget that planning should be happening in every stage.
It's so interesting, Mounir, because again, at university, I was taught, again, the concept of plan the work, then work the plan. In other words, I was taught it's a very sequential, linear process. And, over the years, I've actually, I'm just going to say it. I don't believe that statement anymore. I think planning is more of an agile, repetitive process that should be done at every phase throughout the project lifecycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we agree with that. And as a result of that, because to me is that when we talk about project lifecycle management, is that the success of the project depend on the success of every single stage. Because if we fail in the feasibility and the concept and definition of the project, then obviously the consequences will be higher, the higher chance of failure later. So basically, what it's also interesting in what you're saying is that you are basically linking risk management as part of planning. So basically, it sounds like it is a risk-centric approach for managing project. Would that be fair?
That's an interesting way of describing it. I look at it as we're adding a dimension to forecasting. Traditional forecasting, I think we inherently think about time, how long is the project going to take, and we think about money, how much is it going to cost us? And again, I've worked on so many projects where the schedule is ridiculously aggressive. So it shows a short duration. Great, we're going to finish in 18 months. That's fantastic. And our $500 million budget, we've actually forecasted it's only going to cost $400,000. Well, okay, that's great. But how realistic are those time and money forecasts? If they're incredibly aggressive, those numbers are next to meaningless. So having this third dimension of confidence is very, very powerful. To give you another example, I recently was assisting an oil and gas owner organization. They were at the concept select phase, Mounir, where they were looking at building an offshore, essentially an offshore platform. And without getting into the technicalities, there were two competing technical solutions that they could adopt in order to achieve the asset. And they were pursuing the cheapest technical option. What they realized, though, as a result of doing a risk assessment on both of the options, the cheapest option actually came with the highest amount of uncertainty and risk. And so when they looked at it through the lens of the risk-adjusted schedule and the risk-adjusted CAPEX expenditure, they actually went with the option B, which on paper was more expensive and longer. And the net of it was they were able to have more control over their capital investment. There was less risk to the organization. They were able to start first production, first oil with a much higher degree of confidence. So having that confidence as to when they were going to start production, because at the end of the day, the project is it's a hockey stick, as you know, right? You burn CAPEX before you even get to first oil, and then you start recouping the CAPEX. Right. So for them, being able to get a commercial agreement on how much they were going to sell each barrel of oil for based on a given start date versus a very high degree of variability on that start date was incredibly valuable to the owner organization.
Yeah, at least from my understanding in the LNG domain, this is usually mean the success and failure of the whole company. Just for those who maybe don't understand the terminology you use in terms of you're talking about the select assess stage. In terms of a project life cycle, that's quite early in the project life cycle, right? I mean, long before engineering.
So actually, Mounir, it's funny, and I apologize, I should have explained some of that terminology, but concept select is, in simple terms, when the organization sits around a boardroom table and says, okay, should we even do this project or not? The project isn't actually a project at that point, it's a proposal. And so, doing that due diligence around CAPEX spend, schedule, and more importantly, risk, that then leads into, in the oil and gas world, there's terminology like, I don't like using acronyms, and now I'm going to use an acronym, but FID, which is financial investment decision, which is basically the go, no go on should we now invest in more detailed design and engineering? Should we partner with the fabrication contractors to do procurement? So, and often that's known as project sanction as well. So really from sanction forward, the project gets sanctioned, that's the organization committing to that CAPEX spend. But I believe pre-sanction, pre-FID, making smart decisions as to whether we should even pursue the project in the first place is just as important as post-FID. And again, I recently worked on a project where the organization, they probably one of the most mature organizations I've worked with regards to what we call stage gate review. So they had very formal requirements for a project going from stage to stage to stage. And again, before FID, they ran a risk assessment, and as a result of that risk assessment, they actually chose not to pursue the project, which sounds very counterintuitive, but from an organizational perspective, it was absolutely the right thing to do. So again, I think A, they wouldn't have got to that, they wouldn't have had that insight without doing the risk analysis, and B, if they didn't have that formal stage process in place, they wouldn't have forced themselves down the, we have to make a go, no-go decision. They probably would have just erroneously trundled, that's not a technical phrase, but they probably would have just drifted into the project, which would have been the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, obviously, a stage gate process would help us avoid the locked-in effect, because sometimes organizations start to say, we want to do this, sounds great, but then later on, market changes, economic changes, technology changes, could say the project doesn't make sense anymore. So what do we do? Do we keep burning money, or do we cancel the project? So canceling a project like this is actually, yes, maybe not a great decision to sometimes we like to do, but it's the indication that of the success of the stage gate model. That's the purpose of it. If the project doesn't make sense anymore, then maybe it should be stopped.
Yep, and not to end that topic on the negative side of a project getting cancelled. Conversely, about 18 months ago, I just rolled off an advisory role with a project that actually spanned about a decade, about 9 years in totality. Probably one of the biggest CAPEX projects ever embarked upon. And what was really interesting was, because the project had I would say they were mid-level mature with regards to stage gate and the formal handover between those stages. At the time, there was quite a bit of overhead, Mounir, in adhering to that stage gate process. It was almost seen as an evil necessary. But what happened was, after that initial phase was finished, the project went into a subsequent phase, basically an extension of life phase of the project. And they were able to go back and take the digitized information that they had captured during those stages in the original phase 1 of the project, which helped them massively accelerate in phase 2. And for me, that was a realization of that there's a phrase that's overly used today. It's a bit of a buzzword, but it's called digital thread. Most people have heard of digital twin. Digital twin is the BIM representation, the multi-dimensional view of the asset once it's built. Digital thread is the digital representation of the work that was carried out during execution. And if it wasn't for the stage gate process being in place, the organization in question wouldn't have had that digital thread library, because they wouldn't have been forced down that sort of semi-formal process of capturing, recording, auditing, standardization of information, things like that.
It sounds interesting, and bring in a topic about not necessarily the complexity of this, but the question is about the maturity of the organization. I mean, does it sound like this process can only be done by organization with high level of maturity, or in terms of risk, if we expand the topic to talk more about risk management in general, could it be done by organization that is probably still learning project management, or not as high in the maturity level? Yeah,
it's going to be hard for me to give you a non-biased answer here, or even if I give you a non-biased answer, you're going to think I'm biased, because I'm out of the gate, I'm going to say, irrespective of maturity, there is benefit in formality of either risk analysis and or stage gate process. I've worked with organizations that are literally planning, $50,000 projects in Excel. They still benefit from that formality. And of course, then you have all the way to the other end of the spectrum. I think as a guy that's made his career in software within project and construction management, one of the biggest lessons I've learned is, again, as humans, we don't like complicated. We like even complicated problems to be made simple. And so if there is complexity in the science of risk analysis, or there is formality that we don't necessarily want to follow if we've got a stage gate process in place, as long as the tools that are available to us make that overhead easy, then that's a no-brainer. That's a win. And I think, again, you know, as with most sciences, they evolve over time. You know, I first heard about, you know, stage gate process and PLM or full life cycle probably 20 years ago. I think back then it felt a bit theoretical. I don't think there was much appetite for, people didn't understand the benefit of it. And I think in recent years, having tools that make the following of those formal processes as painless as possible and as frictionless as possible, that's a big benefit. And again, you know, I'm a technology guy, but I've never believed in technology leading the betterment of our industry. I think, though, the advent of cloud computing and the ability now for project information to be stored centrally in a highly secure environment in the cloud and then accessed concurrently from multiple contributors, that was probably as instrumental as the advent of the internet 20 years ago. So again, I think, you know, having that ability now to build a cloud platform and pull in multiple data sources. So you know, StageGate, I mean, you know this better than anybody, but StageGate is pulling in, you know, document management, scheduling, cost management, risk analysis, all of the various project management facets, being able to easily link all of those together, and then more importantly, disseminate all of that information through a common platform in the cloud is huge. Like I say, I think that's a bigger breakthrough than the advent of the internet.
Based on what I understand is that risk management shouldn't be an exercise that we do once, maybe prior to FID, the investment to final decision point. It should be happening throughout. How would that function along the life cycle of the project? Would the focus of risk management change as we move along the life cycle?
I don't think well, first of all, I do absolutely believe it should be a continuous process. I don't think the focus changes. I think the degree of accuracy and depth of information increases over time. And so, you know, you start off with maybe a high level 50 line item risk model at the beginning, and then that evolves into a multi-thousand line item model by the time you get to execution, and that's okay.
What I meant probably by the area of focus is that potentially thinking of risk management at two different levels. Obviously, we have the ultimate objective is the project risks, right? But within every project, as we work on a stage, could there be stage-specific risks that we must address as well?
That's so interesting, Mounir. Recently, now let me back up. Up until recently, we came up with a one-size-fits-all template for quantifying risk events and uncertainty. And it was sort of like a cheat sheet where you would categorize high risk, low risk. It was a bit more advanced than that, but it was quantifying risk. What we've realized is the quantification of risk and or opportunity, the scale needs to be geared towards stage, because in the very early stage of a project, the amount of variability and the probability of a risk is probably much higher than the same risk that's further down in the life cycle of the project, because by then you've mitigated, so the probability is less, and more importantly, the variability is less as well. So in the early stages, we may articulate, well, the risk might be anywhere from 25% to 50% probability. Well, that's a huge swing. As we understand more about the risk, maybe that we've got incoming bids from the contractors, maybe we know more about the environmental factors, that probability will be a firmer, less variable value. So I'm a huge advocate of parsing risk information, whether it's risk registers or risk models, from stage to stage to stage. The worst experience for me is when I get called in as a risk advisor into an organization where they are mid-project in their life cycle, and they say, well, we want you to start with a blank sheet of paper in terms of the risk events. That's terrible. What we really should be doing is taking what we had from the prior stage and further articulating, firming it up, validating it. So this concept of retaining information from stage to stage, but improving the granularity and the fidelity of that information, for me is key. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember one case years ago, I was doing training for one of the major technology companies and on risk management. And the challenge was, in the early stages of the project, when you have the proposals, the sales team working with the client, trying to sell the services, and they do the risk assessment and do all of the stuff, and they document all the work. And then when the implementation team is handed over to start to work, they win the contract, none of that stuff get transitioned. And it's totally lost. So basically, no formal process of doing the transfer or custody transfer, or not only on risk, on everything else. And that was, and at that time, that was one of the major assessment questions to you guys. You are basically, you're burning your history here. You have a lot of history you have to document. Another question I have is that, well, obviously, if we're talking about CAPEX, meaning the industries that deal with CAPEX project, oil and gas, industrial facilities, those kind of things. So in your view, can we do these type of project without a formal stage gate process? And I will follow up a little bit later on why I say that.
Can we, I think what you're asking me is, can we still be effective without a
stage gate process? A stage gate process, of course, in my view, stage gate process is part of risk mitigation as well, right? Or risk management on a project, because the idea,
I think you can muddle your way through. I think an organization would end up being reactive in absence of having a stage gate process versus being proactive. I think you would spend more time mitigating risks that have happened versus planning your way out of risks that may happen because you've been proactive.
Yeah. So the word, I don't know if there are any PMI audience here, because the word mitigation usually it is done before for those PMI terminology. The idea is that we mitigate the risk that we've already identified before it happened, right? And what you were talking about is more of a response to event that has happened that should have been identified as risk.
Exactly. So mitigation is just one of many risk response forms. Again, an interesting concept here. You can still respond to a risk that's already happened, because as a result of risk, there may be additional sub-risks that are now on the table. A risk may not be a single point in time. It may be an ongoing exposure that has partially exposed itself. But again, I think that's just me being overly complicated, and really I should just say, well, actually, it's risk response is an ongoing, it's like planning. It's an ongoing, repetitive process.
No, I mean, what you just described is what, I mean, references like the PMI framework is people talk about secondary risk, we talk about residual risk. But, I wanted to highlight the terminology is because some people only think of mitigation as something before a risk happened. And if the risk happened, it's then we are responding to a risk that has occurred, or something that we don't even anticipate. So there's a problem that has happened that maybe as a lesson learned should have been identified as a lesson learned. So basically, in that case, what we are saying, the reason I asked a question about life, can we work without a stage gate process? Because especially today with the emergence of technology and a lot of people online that are coming from a technology background, We often hear the debate is that the project lifecycle or the stage gate process is dead. You care to elaborate on that?
I'm not sure. I'll try. I haven't heard too many extreme statements like that. I think what I've seen in the planning and scheduling industry is retirement of expertise, I think is probably the best way to describe it. So, again, in the scheduling world, there is a technique called critical path methodology, which is, again, irrespective of software, it's a it's a globally adopted means of scheduling multiple parallel paths of work and understanding the relative, what we call float or wiggle between those paths. I think from a planning perspective, one of the reasons why as an industry we're not getting better at forecasting is the expertise around CPM scheduling is retiring out, and people are, that the younger generation, not to be ageist in any way, but I think the younger generation expect to sit in front of a piece of software and just run the software and get the answer. And I think we need to take a step back, and we've made the tools so easy to use. We've hidden the underlying engines, in my example, CPM. And maybe the same thing applies to stage gate. I think as humans evolve, we like easy. We like to jump in our car and speak to the car and tell it, hey, I want the fastest route to the movie theater. 20 years ago, I'd get the map book out and I'd scan through the map book. We like easy. And so maybe there's a misperception that stage gate is going to slow me down. I just want to focus on the work in hand. And that goes back to my comment, Mounir, about any formality in life is going to carry an overhead. But as a software vendor, if we can make that formality as quick and painless and frictionless as possible, then the net benefit outweighs the overhead of having to implement that process. So I think it's up to us as software vendors the benefit of stage gate is impossible to challenge. The benefit of safety systems in a car is impossible to challenge. So those kind of things, they're a given. It's how easy and painless do we make those benefits to the human. So I think it rests on the shoulders of software vendors.
I want to stress something you just said. You equated the stage gate process to safety system in a car. To you, is that important?
Yes, because it's the lifeline for a successful project. Projects have so many stakeholders, so many moving parts. Even a project isn't just complicated because we don't know how we're going to build and when we're going to build and how much it's going to cost us to build. In many cases, the scope of what we're building is a variable as well. There is just an infinite number of moving parts in a project. And so without that formality and checks and balances and movement of information through the project lifecycle, how can we be expected to be successful?
Absolutely. Now, I have a related question here. I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in what you said. Otherwise, I would not have invested years of my life into building this concept into the Uruk platform. But it's funny because one time, I don't know if you've seen or read the book Capital Project. That was written by a gentleman that worked for IPA, which is the Independent Project Analysis. And I remember very clearly and it's about the benchmarking they do for Capital Project. And in the introduction chapter, basically he was sharing a story where he went into a meeting with executive. And then as he started talking, the executive were rolling their eyes and saying, oh no, not another stage gate presentation, right? So to them, it becoming is like, is that maybe it's a bureaucratic process. I mean, and outside the oil and gas and the CAPEX industry, we've heard the comment that, the stage gate process is just bureaucratic process. It slows us down. I mean, I have an answer for that, but I would love to hear your answer. Obviously, it's clear you don't agree with that, but. If you care to
I think it
elaborate.
actually, I would argue it speeds a project up. And it's interesting you mentioned IPA. So my organization, PM Focus, we focus on the risk aspect. We almost without exception get brought into a project prior to IPA coming in and doing the benchmarking. And it's because IPA then use the outputs from our risk analysis in their own internal benchmarking. And again, as a result of the combination of the IPA benchmarking and the risk analysis, the project's actually able to accelerate because they don't go down paths that they perhaps would have gone down and then had to reverse back out if they didn't have the insight that those organizations bring to the table.
Yep, I mean, I definitely agree. I believe the stage gate process is definitely help us speed the project, not slow it down. And my answer for those who talk about bureaucracy, my answer usually is that, look, if the organization is bureaucratic in nature, even if you have one gate, you're going to have a problem, right? So the challenge for us, not only as a software vendor in general, in project management community, is that how do we help facilitate the decision making that it's very efficient, effective, fast decision making, and not being bogged down in analysis paralysis.
It's funny that you mentioned decision making. Prepping for our session today, I was wondering what questions you were going to ask me, and I was thinking about if you asked me, well, what does all this risk analysis magic boil down to? For me, it's informed decision. It's another lens through which I can understand what's at stake with the project in order to make an informed decision. So again, bubbling that back up, stage gate risk analysis, digital thread, digital twin, all of these endeavors, they're all geared towards empowering me as a decision maker with as much knowledge as possible. And I use the word knowledge, not data, because we live in a world that is
correct,
data driven, but data actually doesn't tell me anything. Data is just, it's one step beyond zeros and ones. That's not helpful to me. What's helpful though is to understand what that data is telling me, and whether I use a benchmarking approach or risk approach, all of those techniques help me in making astute decisions to basically go, no go to the next stage. It's like a handoff. It's like a formal handoff is how it's
correct. You froze for a second, but I think the message was clear. So in your view, what is the biggest benefit of stage gate process? You already mentioned informed decision making. Anything else come to mind?
It's the consistency of flow of information throughout the project that can then be used to make informed decisions. It's cutting down the silos and the boundaries, the firewalls of information. Historically, information is very stop-start in a project throughout the project lifecycle, and StageGate ensures continuity of information flow. And then I think the software tools that support StageGate enable me to get to that information very, very quickly.
Okay. I have one more question, actually, maybe two. Does the stage gate process stop when the project is finished, or is there things to go beyond it?
Gosh, there's a question. It's interesting because most of us think of a project, most of us think of the finish of the project as the finish of the project. That sounded a bit silly, but it really, the finish of the project is the start of the life of the asset, right? So, so again, I think when it gets to preventative maintenance, scheduled maintenance, understanding the viability of the asset throughout the remainder of its life, you can still apply stage gate processes. You may not need as many steps or frequency of stages during the operational life cycle, but having those in place, I think the benefits are exactly the same as having steps during the CAPEX spend phase.
That one question I have, I will leave to the end if we have time. We'll leave the chance for anyone attending to ask. Fadi, you have a question, you want me to read it, or you feel like you want to go online and speak about it?
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thanks, Mounir.
Hello,
My
Fadi.
name is Fadi. I live in UAE. I have a small company called Strategic Anchors. I provide management consultancies to construction engineering, including project management. I have a client right now. It's a small construction company, and he wants to look at the operations KQC. And I found that he basically doesn't have any project management methodology or process. He has just some documents his project managers filled. Now reading about the stage gates and discussing with Mounir so many times and reading his books and papers. Now I see that it's a very important thing to manage risks in the project. Although it's small project, sometimes 100 million dirhams is around $30 million construction project. Let's say it's a 12 stories building. Now how to choose those stage gates as a way to control the construction phase of the contractor. Are there some criteria that I need to look at, or I just look at the schedule or program and choose those milestones and take them as stage gates?
You're talking from the construction contractor perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. Construction contractor perspective. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dan
is yours.
I'll try and answer that one. I think if I understand the question correctly, you're wanting guidance on how to slice up the project into stages and have stage gates between those stages. So I would use a hybrid of I would take a standard project life cycle set of stages and the standard templates out there based on industry. You mentioned schedule. I would then look at your schedule and from maybe an owner perspective, look at the key points during the construction phase that are step changes in your investment risk. So is it, okay, well, I have a partnering agreement with a contractor, that would be one. At what point in time am I committing to my CAPEX procurement items? At what point in time am I breaking ground? I would perhaps look at it that way. But again, I would start with standard stage gate templates, the industry standard templates. So Mounir, you probably have a better answer than me on that one.
Yeah, for the construction stage, I mean, from an owner perspective, you're absolutely right. From a contractor perspective, I think what contractors need to understand that they could use a stage gate process. If they want to use it only for construction work, it's really then nothing more than a milestone and maybe key decision point that need to happen along the life cycle, along the phase. However, as a contractor, they can still use a life cycle model, right? As long as they are willing to use it starting from the minute they received a request for proposal, right? Because technically speaking, a request for proposal is the trigger that starts the discussion on the project. Yeah, and maybe I know sometimes contractors don't like to hear this. Maybe a contractor could say no to an RFP, or maybe they will do some initial analysis and they determine, look, we cannot do this project. So we might be losing credibility or whatever the case might be if we proceed with this project, if we don't have enough competence or capacity or whatever the case might be. So yes, the stage gate process can be used for a service provider, a construction company in this case, as long as they use it long before they even get to the point where they have contract award for construction. So they need to go through the early stages, the sales cycles, all of that. These are stages of a project.
It's interesting, Mounir, the question posed was, should I align my stage gates perhaps with my schedule? Maybe think about turning that on its head when you define your top-down schedule before you do your bottom-up scheduling. Maybe that top-down schedule and the deliverables and milestones should actually hang against the stage gate points. So build your schedule against the stage gates versus the other way around.
Yeah.
Mounir, can I put something in here?
Yeah, sure, Bill, go ahead.
I'm going to suggest taking a half step back and looking at the purpose behind stage gates and phasing. And in my mind, the purpose is to make sure that you don't overcommit with inadequate information. So if I look at how I would want to design a stage gate process for a construction contractor, I think that would be very different than what it would look like for the owner.
Correct.
I liked where you started. My former partner and I had a very simple partnership agreement. And one of the key phrases was, we won't do business with assholes.
Yeah.
And whenever we got an RFP in, that was always the first question we asked, based upon what we knew about the prospect, based upon what was in the RFP or the contact, and said, you know, is this somebody we want to do work with? And if the answer was no, then that initial stage gate was met and it was no proposal.
Yeah.
Then we went into a proposal analysis phase, which was, why might we win? Why might we lose? How much will it cost us to prepare the proposal, and so on? And the actual delivery of services was the last phase. So I think however you decide to do it, you want to focus on that. Do we want to go the next step? Do we have enough information? Do we have enough insight? That ties to Dan's comments about risks. What are the risks of proceeding into the next phase with only the information we have now?
All right. Excellent. Great. Bob, you want to raise your question, or should we read it? Okay, the question from Bob is basically, in the spirit of easy, it seems the stage gate process information would be an input channel into lessons learned material and should make the digital thread more robust going forward into future project and program.
So Bob, this is a topic that's very close to my heart and something that I'm actively looking at the moment. So the concept of kind of like a knowledge loop and lessons learned. So taking the good, the bad, the risks that occurred, the risks that didn't, effectiveness of mitigation, activities that slipped, activities that had a cost overrun, feeding those into some form of knowledge library such that the next go around in a subsequent project, as we're doing our time and money and certainty forecasting, being able to have guidance from that knowledge library into, okay, are we being overly aggressive in our scheduling? Are we being overly optimistic in how much these elements are going to cost us? And using those lessons learned is of course valuable. Now, prior to the advent of cheap computing power and you know, machine learning, AI, and that's a whole nother topic. But I mean, those technologies have been around for years and years. Computers are very good at mining information, looking at well, they're now very good at looking at patterns. That's very hard for human. That's an expensive human manual process to go back and mine that information for lessons learned. Thankfully now, again, with computing power being so fast and cheap, I think we're starting to see projects benefit from those lessons learned on prior projects. So I'm a huge advocate and fan of capturing that information throughout the life cycle so that it can be reused on subsequent projects. So yeah, I think you know, benefiting from prior knowledge is a hugely untapped area we're going to see great advances in.
Yep. Amr, I'm assuming you would want to speak your question.
Yeah. Actually, my question is related to the CAPEX and risk management. Dan, you know, in Saudi Arabia, there are so many multi-billion projects are being developed in the same time. They will definitely go to construction at the same time as well. So the scarcity of resources and consequently, the price inflation is expected and recorded in the risk register. My question is, should we add the expected price inflation to the direct cost of construction in the CAPEX, which may harm the project feasibility and makes the project subject to cancellation, or keep it outside under the risk contingency? So what is the right action here, please?
Great question. I'm going to give you I'm going to give you the consultant answer, which is I'm going to sit on the fence. I'll give you my real answer, but I don't think it really matters. It boils down. You can model it. You can take escalation market conditions and incorporate them into your CAPEX model. And I have some organizations that do that. I have other organizations that say no. We want a more pure CAPEX risk model, and then the economics team within the organization will take the portfolio of projects that each carry their CAPEX risk, and against that we will risk things like escalation and market conditions. The maths is the same. I think if you bundle in escalation and market competitiveness into your discrete project models, you do run the risk of potentially canceling the project without unfairly canceling the project, whereas really the no cancel decision should be made at the program or the portfolio level. So it's my preference to model those risks, albeit model them outside of the CAPEX model at the project level. Does that make sense?
Actually, it does, and this is my opinion as well. However, we received pushback from upper management because if you are definitely expecting there will be cost escalation or inflation, so it has to be inside the CAPEX. And that will change the financial outcome of the project.
Amr, I have something to say here. I remember years ago we had similar problem, even with cement, and get to the point where the countries and the region where basically couldn't even get cement to their project, right? Because, and this is what happened in Dubai when Dubai was booming. Everybody planned their project like there is nothing else going on, and as a result, end up being with too many problems. Also, if you remember, probably you were in the area at the time as well, when China was starting to boom, the prices of metal and coppers and all of these things that happened. So I don't know if you, many client organization at that time, to avoid their contractor putting a huge contingency into their bids, as they came up with what they call the risk sharing model. Like you will agree that, escalation up to a certain point is you take it, contractor, and then if it is something goes beyond certain index or whatever way that can measure, then the owner would share in those risks. Yeah, Dan?
Risk sharing is really interesting. I'm experiencing owner organizations now, they're doing their project level risk analysis. They're rolling those projects then up into their programs or portfolios. They are doing risk sharing between projects. You alluded to risk sharing between owner contractors. I think owners now are getting so smart in the realms of risk that they're actually looking at sharing risk between projects, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think I read a study on Australia when I was doing my work research for the mega project book I wrote, is that I think they adopted what they call portfolio risk. So basically, whatever contingency need to be agreed on for the project, they put it into the portfolio level and then shared among all the projects.
Yeah, so there's a misperception that if my required contingency is 20% of my CAPEX within my project, therefore I need 20% contingency at the portfolio level, and that is actually not correct.
Yeah, correct, because it's shared.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
And the probability of each of those projects needing the 20% is not 100%.
Right. All right. It's actually 3 minutes to go. If we want to go to the full hour, any last remaining question? If not, Dan, any last comment you would like to share with us that we did not cover today, you would like to emphasize before we close?
No, I think it would have been bad form if we overran a webinar on topic related to schedule overrun. But no, I mean, as always, Mounir, in these sessions, I think we get presented as the the domain expert and the one responsible for sharing knowledge. I learn more from these sessions than than I think I give. So I actually learned a lot. I think that the comments around risk sharing, I think that would be a whole webinar into itself, maybe a subsequent session. I think the concept of formal stage gate beyond the end of the CAPEX expenditure is interesting.
Yeah.
And again, I think just from sitting here as a software, someone that's been responsible and is responsible for helping the industry by bringing products to the table, anything we can do, the benefit of stage gate is unquestionable. It's upon us as the software vendors now to make that as easy and frictionless as possible. And I know you guys are doing a great job doing that. So I think it's a very exciting subdomain within project management, construction management right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I know certain industry, when we talk about maturity, they are more mature in this area of the stage gate process. The challenge for us, and this is one of the things that I've been, trying to deal with for many years, and the reason we started our work and methodology in now Uruk, is that basically how do we transfer that concept, some of the mature practices that we do in CAPEX project to other domain and industry, and where sometimes, I mean, they never even heard the word stage gate before, right? Or they think of stage gate process as a bureaucracy. So that's one of the biggest challenges we're trying to tackle through our tailoring concept that we are adopting in Uruk.
Someone shared with me earlier this week, Mounir, the concept of, well, we were talking about marketing, and in formal marketing, there is the concept of an organization having a voice. Is your voice a formal professor type of voice, or it is a very casual Facebook-esque friendly voice? And it got me thinking about products and software, because software and products, I believe, should have a voice as well. And I think in the case of you guys, you've done a very good job of, you have this blended, it's like you are an empowering, friendly mentor from a voice of the product perspective, because when I use your software, it's absolutely formal. It's a guide, but it's not. It doesn't intimidate me. It doesn't make me feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. It actually does, or it empowers me because it is easy to use. It's got that friendly approach, but it's still formal to a degree. So I think I'm rambling a bit about software here, but having an appropriate voice in a software product is really important. And I think you guys are going down a great route with that voice.
Yeah, this is a major challenge because we're trying to make it as basically as a learning platform, because we are providing the methodology. So we're providing guidance of how to manage project. And therefore, there has to be an educated or knowledge sharing perspective. But it's a challenge, yes. What's acceptable, how formal or informal or friendly you try to be. Unfortunately, we still haven't found the right balance, because what we see and what we hear are different. Some people like more formality, some people like it more casual.
Sure.
So I think it's going to be a learning process for us as well as we start going to market. Great. Dan, thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you here, and thanks everybody for attending. Our next webinar is in a couple of weeks with our another colleagues and friend, Sandra Hoskins. She delivered one workshop before, and then she will be doing another one again. And Bill was here on the line. Bill have delivered 2 workshops for us as well. And all of these webinars are available, recording are available on our YouTube channel. So basically, and we will share, obviously this one we will share by tomorrow, but you can also find the previous webinar that were done by Bill and by Sandra and others as well on our YouTube channel. Thanks everyone, and wish you a great day.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.